individuals can be taught to read to their potential, including those who have been diagnosed with dyslexia. If your child struggles with learning, contact us to discuss our one-to-one summer instruction. In just a few weeks, our Learning Center can help make your child feel more confident and prepared for school. Call us at 800-233-1819 or visit our website, Lindamood-Bell.com. Today's episode is a webinar entitled Evidence-Based Solutions for Dyslexia and Reading Comprehension Weakness. It's delivered by Lindamood-Bell's Director of Research and Development, Paul Worthington.
Hello, my name is Paul Worthington. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Lindamood-Bell Learning Processes. Appreciate you taking the time to join us on this webinar where we're going to be looking at the research that we've been doing along with some of our colleagues in research institutions to address evidence-based solutions for children who have language and learning problems. So to begin, let's just quickly cover the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about a theory that we have been researching over the last several decades in terms of the work that we've been doing. It's called dual coding theory. We're going to apply that to the research that we've been doing in the area of dyslexia that started way back with Georgetown University, MIT, and more recently with the University of Washington and currently with Stanford. And in addition to dyslexia, we're going to address our findings where dual coding theory is applied to comprehension. And we're going to end with some details on the application of it to what we're now calling the cognitive science of learning. Before we go, just a reminder, and I think all of you will probably have some awareness of this in terms of how important this information is. Learning to read and comprehend serves as a foundation for all educational pursuit and indeed for economic success in life, yet millions of students struggle to learn. Yet 15% of the school population in America, more than 7.2 million students, have a condition qualifying them for special education. 85% of those students have a primary learning disability in reading and/or processing language. The most common type of learning disability is dyslexia. It's estimated that 1 out of 10 people have dyslexia. Over 20% of the world's population are affected by a learning disability if we start to look at this whole thing from a global standpoint. So the detail on that is with a world population of 7.9 billion, approximately 1.58 billion people experience a learning disability. The big issue is, with that knowledge, is what do we have as evidence-based solutions? As you know, the policy of the United States government and states, we have to have evidence-based to support the interventions that we're doing with students. Innovative evidence-based interventions now show that all individuals can learn and read to comprehend to their potential. Obviously, there are a lot of variables that affect that, including those qualifying for special ed and/or those students or individuals diagnosed with dyslexia. I'd like to put a face to this and just show you a quick video of a mother and a youngster by the name of Tallulah.
My daughter Tallulah is 7 years old and we're in Australia. Tallulah is a fantastic kid. She has always been so bright and funny and interested in people and conversation. Her verbal capacity has always been huge. I guess because she was very verbal from when she was very young, we just assumed that she would be fantastic at school. The grade 1 teacher at the time called me. I said to her, I'm having some troubles taking Tallulah to school. She was crying in the morning at school. I just said to the teacher, you're going to have to work out what's going on. You have to help me work out what's going on. And she rang me a few days later and she said, I've done some tests on Tallulah. I think she might have dyslexia. That's why my bright, competent, social, amazingly gifted in terms of her vocabulary child can't read. Our educational psychologist recommended Lindamood-Bell. As I looked into it more and read the research articles and spent time on the internet, I wanted to know that it worked for real people like myself and my family. If it does work, it'll bridge the gap from where we are now to where we want to be in terms of her reading, and hopefully the rest will just take care of itself. And that's what happened. She just ran up the stairs, so happy to be here, looked at me with a big smile on her face and said, "See ya, I'll see you tonight." And I just thought, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be really good. So Seeing Stars is about showing children how to visualise in their head words and what they look like and then what they sound like. So words and sounds and combinations of sounds. So I went in and I watched her work with the teacher for the first time, and it's still emotional now because I remember I distinctly remember sitting there thinking, my daughter couldn't read on Monday and now she can read. It was just, sorry. I was so proud of her, and I was so pleased that we had made the sacrifice that we had made, and so relieved that it turned out to be the right choice. 5 days, yep. When we did the assessment, we showed our individual needs teacher at the school that Tallulah is at, and she said, looking at Tallulah now, in terms of her comprehension and her reading ability, I wouldn't even see a dyslexic profile. She said to me, whatever you did last year, whatever intervention you did last year has just really stood her in great stead to be at the point that she is now, and we can just move forward. Doing Lindamood-Bell has changed our life. It's changed our family's life.
Within our learning centers throughout the United States and now internationally, if we look at the allocation of students who have decoding and/or comprehensions deficits, you see some percentages here. This includes a number between the years of 2008 to the present of students that we've worked with that fall into these categories, and then just a little bit more. We've broken it up to students who have decoding and comprehension issues. We even looked at students who have math, comparatively, issues from a diagnostic protocol, and then, of course, the two big ones that we're going to talk about today, decoding and comprehension. So if you look at the combination of those two where decoding and comprehension is concerned. So it's interesting that we're not just isolating these one from another, but we're looking at the combination of these two primary issues that children and or adults are faced with. So what's the theoretical model that we're looking at? And the proposition is that this particular model, if we're looking at what might be referred to as construct validity in terms of the clinical work that we're doing, is referred to as dual coding theory. And I'm going to apply this to literacy at large as opposed to just reading. The individual most responsible, in fact, solely responsible for the application of this theory is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Alan Pavio. Cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of mental representations and imagery are integrated. And performance, in this case, literacy performance, is mediated by the joint activity of verbal and nonverbal systems. Cognition is always an interplay between the verbal and nonverbal systems. Let's see if that applies as we look at the data that we're talking about. To put some peer-reviewed evidence to this, out of the theoretical models and processes of literacy, the most recent edition of this book, Sadowski indicates that DCT is among the strongest current candidates for developing a unified scientifically based theory of literacy. The principles of DCT apply to grapheme phoneme correspondence, vocabulary, grammar, the construction of mental models of text episodes, and imaginative responses to text, including the social constructs itself and others in literacy encounters. The bottom line, this model addresses decoding as well as oral and written language comprehension and memory. It doesn't just perseverate on issues of decoding only. This is a key indication, if you would keep that into consideration as we look at the evidence from what you're about to see. If we look underneath this model, what we're proposing is that there are three particular important sensory, what we call sensory cognitive functions. We all know about the issue of phonemic awareness, the ability to perceive the identity number and sequence of sounds within words, what we also call symbol imagery, the ability to create mental images for sounds and letters within words, and concept imagery, the ability to create an image gestalt or a whole for both oral and written language. So if we look at these two types of imagery, one being predominantly applied to decoding, one being predominantly applied to oral and written language comprehension. Symbol imagery, the imagery for sounds and letters within words for decoding. And yes, imagery goes to sounds as well as to letters. And then concept imagery is an image whole for both oral and written language, where you're thinking of mental representations at a global level as opposed to the linguistic side where you're addressing the need for sounds and letters. So how does that apply to decoding? You have a student that you're working with. If they're dyslexic, they have to generate both a sound and a matched correspondence of the alphabetic code, both phonological and orthographic imagery for reading and spelling words. Concept imagery for comprehension and even thinking, one might argue, is necessary for the cognitive part of it, addressing higher order thinking skills such as main idea, conclusion, inference, etc. In other words, students are imaging a whole from what they read and or hear. There's the old cliche, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And that's just a tongue-in-cheek reference to what Pavio is suggesting in dual coding theory that's necessary for language comprehension. Let's dig just a little bit deeper in what we consider to be the component parts of reading. These sensory cognitive functions underlie the component parts of reading, both auditory, visual, and language, and we're going to talk a little bit more on those. And then for comprehension, and I would even add under that comprehension, particular, the addition of the acquisition of vocabulary and the artifacts of memory. So if we parse this out, phonemic awareness and symbol imagery cleanly fall into that auditory circle that directly applies to word attack skills, being able to look at a word for the first time and then say the word, an important consideration in the acquisition of decoding skills. On the visual side, symbol imagery, the integration of those, making sure that you put the phonetic structure along with the alphabetic code in the host language, English, any other Indo-European language, for example. And then finally, down here at language, the application of those particular component parts to contextual reading and fluency. And if all those are working in concert with one another, then what's the outcome? If you have concept imagery for comprehension, then you wind up being literate. So, and there it is, the concept imagery component. So, if all that works where decoding theory is applied, let's see how it works from the evidence standpoint as we look at dyslexia. The issue is this: linguistic and/or cognitive competence and performance, including dyslexia, are mediated by the sensory input of mental representations. We think this is a much more comprehensive way to think about it in terms of how to address the needs of students who are dyslexic. You've seen this particular slide, and imagine that of all these, if these component parts are being addressed concurrently and at a fluent level, then you're going to have students who are in a situation where they are now fluent. What are the symptoms that are associated with this? Since we're talking about dyslexics, here's a quick look at it. We're on the weakness side, it's word attack, word recognition, memorizing and retaining sight words, laborious decoding. Spelling certainly is going to fall out as an issue. Difficulty reading fluently, of course, especially in context. Monitoring self-correction in reading. And if it's severe, guess what? You're going to have, especially where as compared to potential, they're going to have a diagnosis of dyslexia. So if we're going to bring this to consciousness, this being the ability to fluently apply symbol imagery, coupled with phonemic awareness, directing instructions to develop that. From an intervention standpoint, an instructor is teacher, whoever is, when a student is challenged in being exposed with a difficult word, what letters did you perceive for even a nonsense pattern? The student can match what they hear with what it is that they're visualizing. That increases the probabilities that they're going to be fluent for that particular process. It's a very explicit necessity in order to bring students to conscious and awareness, both of when they're correct, of course, as well as what they did wrong if they should misdecode a word, for example. Let's look at some data with that brief introduction of bringing those particular sensory cognitive skills to awareness on our Learning Center longitudinal data, in this case, specifically with students who are dyslexic. From 2008 to 2022, we served approximately overall, not parsing dyslexic students out, 33,000 students in those years. 35%, when we started drilling down, or almost 12,000 of those students presented a dyslexic profile, and that's based upon the criteria that the university, our colleagues at the University of Washington and Stanford used to diagnose and single out those students who were exhibiting a dyslexic profile. When we looked further, many of these students that come into our centers already have a previous diagnosis of dyslexia. Out of those 11,000 students, we had 8,600 students who had no previous diagnosis of dyslexia. They weren't identified yet, but yet they had a dyslexic profile. Inversely, we did have 3,000 of those 11,000 plus students were previously diagnosed when they landed on our doorsteps, having been diagnosed with dyslexia. Those are interesting numbers just from the identification standpoint of being able to diagnose students with dyslexia. When we look at then the results, with an average hours of results for students with previous diagnosis of dyslexia, those students being roughly, or actually exactly 2,764 of those students with an average age of 9.7 years of age, having received 123 hours of instruction. There are the pre and post results of working with these students who are diagnosed with dyslexia. And what you're seeing here, underneath here, are the particular psychometric or psychoeducational assessments that we use to identify those students. Of note, look at the verbal potential on receptive oral vocabulary for those students, right around 68%. In other words, their oral language is all fine, in fact, a little bit above average. But when you look at the beginning components, both in terms of their ability to process the orthography, their phonological processing, and then the implications for the word attack skills, the word recognition skills, not to mention, of course, the big ones, the accuracy in their reading, and how fluent they were when they were exposed to text. Now, again, same thing, only taking a look at this from the standpoint of standard score gains. You can see these are by statistical standards. All of these gains, except this one down here, which we weren't even addressed, nor did that even be, or was that an issue for those students. They made highly significant gains across the spectrum, including fluency. Now, I'm guessing, as I mentioned early in the agenda or the introduction, that we've been doing research on the neuroscience side of things. It started way back when at Georgetown. We did some work and by the way, and all this information is published on our website at MIT. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, we started working up at the University of Washington with Jason Yateman and his colleagues. And we're currently, in fact, ongoing right now, is work with Stanford University, specifically looking at the neuroscientific as well as the behavioral profile of students who are dyslexic. The goal of our study that started at the University of Washington was to analyze reading growth curves using or during an intensive summer intervention program. We used the Seeing Stars program for symbol imagery. We collected behavioral measures over 4 sessions, assessing decoding, oral reading fluency, and even, of course, what's the main reason we read? It's to comprehend. Was there a direct effect on their ability to get more awareness of the comprehension of what they read, assuming that we can improve their decoding? These results highlight the opportunity to improve reading skills over an intensive short-term summer session program and the linear dose-response relationship during duration and gains. I'd like to highlight this, a very important consideration and one of the findings as published in this article in Frontiers in Psychology with the primary author being Donnelly. What did we find out? We found out first that there were changes in the white matter and the dosage amounts correlated to changes in reading behavior. This findings from the University of Washington show the intervention's positive efficacy in developing dyslexic readers' sensory cognitive functions, phonemic awareness, orthographic processing, as related to measures of decoding. These findings add validity to the tenets of dual coding theory and suggest the universality of phonemic and/or orthographic awareness and processing with dyslexic profiles. So, an outcome of that study, I think there were 4 papers published on the work that we did there. I'm highlighting just one of them. In the summer of 2020, we initiated a replication study of the work, again with Yateman and his colleagues, that started up in the University of Washington. Like the University of Washington research, this is a neuroscientific intervention study. It's actually a replication study of the Seeing Stars program to address the remediation effects identified as dyslexia. And above and beyond that, we're also comparing the neurological and behavioral effects of conducting the interventions virtually, in other words, online. That was an artifact, basically, that came out of some of our interests with regard to the children during the pandemic that had to receive their reading instruction virtually. So we looked at the profile. Out of the 11,688 students that I referred to earlier, using that population that we have in our centers, being driven by the standards set forth on the qualifications to become be labeled as dyslexic. Here's what we found. Here was the profile for the students who, and what you see down here, if we look at all the students, we found a matched profile for 1,500 if we look at all the students. Remember, I challenged you to think about it in terms of the students who we found who were undiagnosed, the students that were diagnosed, and we then compared that with the profile of the students so far that have participated in the studies that we did up in Washington and at Stanford. So we've got a match profile. We are comparing, if you will, apples and apples across this population. There are the numbers, an important consideration, an important variable in terms of that dose response issue is the average hours of instruction. And what you can see here is that we looked across, and fundamentally, at least from a statistical standpoint, we had a matched hours of instruction with even the children in the neuroscientific studies having received 158.6 hours of instruction with the mean hours. Results. So we took all those students with those hours of instruction and we take a look at then the average standard score gains. And what you see there is the magnitude of change for these students going across. What did we conclude from this? Across this population of all these dyslexic students. Students in the first quartile, now let's back up a little bit. The students who were qualified as dyslexic based upon the standards set forth in the neuroscience investigations, fundamentally, they fall in general in the lowest quartile in terms of their decoding behaviors as compared to excellent verbal or receptive oral language skills. So students in the first quartile and the measures of decoding often do in fact have a dyslexic profile. The question is, after the intervention, did we find a significant number of students moving beyond the first quartile into the normal range of reading? Let's take a look at the results. What you see here are increases in the first quartile comparatively with no change and or a decrease. So where symbol imagery is concerned, the orthographic processing component for all students, and there was essentially a match, of course, because it's just representing the full measure of all the students that went through this analysis, we see that 79% of the students increased one or more quartiles. If we look at word attack, roughly the same with 77 students. Now, the big issue is their word recognition skill. That seems to be sort of the height of the bar issue as to whether or not a student has word recognition skills as compared to their oral language vocabulary skills. What did we find there? We find that 70% of the students moved out of that first quartile into a second or third quartile. What do those numbers indicate for you? Keeping in mind that that was with on average around 130 hours of instruction. And the bonus, what happens to their comprehension if we increase their decoding skills? We know that they had the oral language skills. We see that over half the kids increase one quartile or more in their language comprehension skills. So these 140 or 1,480 dyslexic students in our learning centers, subtracting out the 46, demonstrated reading progress statistically equivalent to that of the students in the as was published in the neuroscientific interventions out of the University of Washington. Pretty impressive from the standpoint of challenging the idea on whether or not these students are still dyslexic. In fact, Nancy Bell indicates that it's inaccurate to suggest that a reading disability such as dyslexia is a lifelong challenge that cannot be changed. If the brain can change, the reading behaviors can change. Okay, putting dyslexia aside, what about language comprehension? Does dual coding theory apply to that as well? Let's look at the research and the evidence. You might remember, as I suggested earlier, that concept imagery and comprehension thinking are allocated towards these important skills from an academic or educational standpoint. You'll hear people say, at least from an oral language standpoint, sometimes it feels like information is going in one ear and out the other. But it certainly applies to written language as well, where the student primarily graphs only parts of what it is that they're reading or hearing. They get random details and or facts. again, to put a human face to this, I want to talk to you, have you take a look at a short video of a college student in this case who was washing out because he had no decoding skills, because he had substantive language comprehension skills.
What happened?
Okay, that's a good point. If I just had to read, it would take me a day to go through a page because I'd have to read it, but like read sentence by sentence, this word by word. And my main problem was that I think what I did is in my mind I had like these dictionary, and I'd go read word by word, and my mind would flip through each word, find the meaning, and it would make no sense together at all.
That's amazing.
And it was just so, I didn't know what I was reading, and I'd have to read each sentence 3 times and go to the next sentence and read it 3 times and go to the next sentence, read it 3 times. And it was just such a pain. So, and I didn't remember any of it, so.
It's better, huh?
Yeah, I can read a lot better now. I really think that that I noticed a difference in that, especially that big difference that I really noticed it. Now I get better all the time. But the big jump where I really noticed it was the first time I could see it moving. First time where I got to see things in sequence.
It was hanging together.
Yeah, and you know what else is? I think that this is why I think this idea is good for everybody, because I think I had this ability like everybody else did. I probably made pictures, or I had the ability to make pictures, but I never even tried to find them. So I think that the neatest thing about this program of yours is not that you have to teach people how to make pictures, you just have to make them realize that they can do it.
That's right, just bring it to their attention.
So, because it was easy to, just have to keep working at it, but I had a week. In a week, I'm already seeing pictures, and I think that's no problem.
It could have been done for you years and years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just got to teach people, that you do make pictures, and you got to look at them.
The other thing that I'm finding really interesting is that you can affect long-range memory, Marco.
Yeah.
Things that we used to think, we'll read something and we'll remember it for a little while, and it's going to go out of our head. I'll bet you'll be able to remember this information about this, and if I brought you in 2 weeks from now, we did another video, you'd probably be able to tell me the whole thing. Because once you have those images in your head, they seem to stay for a long time.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, before when I'd read something, you could ask me maybe 30 seconds, and maybe I'd get it. But past 30 seconds, no clue. So I think you're right. This way, I bet you could have days. Because I just go back. Because I would go back to when you read, I'm talking out loud, and what I was doing is I used to read. Say it out loud. I used to talk better if I read out loud, which was really funny for college students because people look at you funny and think, "What's this guy 3rd grade?" So I had to read out loud, and then what it's like is people would. It's like somebody was talking to me. So the only memory I had is the same thing as if you had read it to me and I would have heard it, but I didn't see anything. Now that I see my own pictures, it's like so it's much easier to remember because I have not only did I read it, so I heard it, but I see it, and I remember a lot better when I see it.
If we look at that from a weakness standpoint, just as we looked at the weaknesses from a symptom standpoint in decoding, this is what shows up if language comprehension tends to be a predominant issue. Obviously, weak written language, oral language, translated into difficult logical thinking and problem solving, following directions, expressing oneself orally, expressing language in writing. What's the writing look like? Think about this. Written language, what we write, or what precedes what we write, is what we're thinking about. If what we're thinking about is not clearly understood, then what's going to show up in language expression, both orally and in written? And you'll see that in more severe situations, we're going to talk about that in a second, social situations, people don't get jokes. The effects are far-reaching. Cause and effects issue. And if it's a severe weakness, many of these students have even diagnosed with hyperlexia and or autism spectrum disorders. Just like we have to bring language to consciousness for decoding students, we do the same thing. And with the results you're going to see, we've done the same thing with students who exhibit these language comprehension deficits. Instead of asking for particular phonemes or letter, digraph, symbols as related to decoding, we're asking the students to visualize, or what they picture, once language comes into the brain. It's a conscious process from a pedagogy standpoint to bring this to a conscious awareness. I'll go ahead and use the term that you're probably all familiar with in terms of metacognition. Thinking about what your brain needs to be doing to gain information from print once you hear it or once you read it. Let's talk about what we see from the interventions associated with this process utilizing dual coding theory. If we look at the students who, in that pie chart I showed you earlier, were comprehension-only students. They had no decoding issues. We found over 6,000 of those kids did have exclusively issues with regard to their ability to comprehend oral and written language. And here's some of the results. If we look at changes in their vocabulary, keep in mind, if it's a comprehension issue, you would expect lower vocabulary, and there are the resulting changes. Most importantly, there's a change in reading comprehension. They basically double their ability to understand what it is that they read on an average of just over 100 hours of instruction. From a standard score standpoint, you're seeing the same thing, only relative to how that appears in standard scores, with reading comprehension having statistically significant large standard score changes. Digging even deeper, if we take a look at students in the severe category where their comprehension is clear down in the 8th percentile, what are the effects in changing their ability to comprehend what it is that they read? It's gone from the lower quartile, if we were to look at this from a quartile standpoint, again, up to the average for the population at large. There it is from a standard score standpoint, highly significant. And by the way, this includes data for 837 students between the years of 2008 up to date. From the neuroscientific standpoint, we had an invitation from the University of Alabama. We're now in our 5th and 6th years of the study on taking dual coding theory, applying it to the language comprehension needs in an intervention study with students who are on the autism spectrum disorder. It looks like this. From the paper by Murdaugh et al., they say deficits in language comprehension have been widely reported in children with autism spectrum disorders. This study used a translational and neuroimaging approach to test the role of visual imagery-based reading intervention. In this case, it's called Visualizing and Verbalizing Program, in improving the brain circuitry underlying language processing in children with autism spectrum disorders. What did they find? Functional magnetic resonance imaging in a longitudinal study design was used to investigate the intervention change in sentence comprehension, brain activation, and functional connectivity in 3 groups of participants. These are all 18 to 13-year-old autistic children. We had an experimental group, a waitlist control group, and a group of typically developing controlled children. After the intervention, the experimental group showed significant increases in activity in the visual and language areas of the right hemisphere language area, homologs, the putamen and the thalamus, suggested of compensatory routes to increasing proficiency in reading comprehension. They quote in this paper, thus the findings of this study, which support the principles of dual coding theory, suggest the potential of strength-based reading intervention in changing brain responses and facilitating better reading comprehension in ASD students. And so this was very positive for us, that in the application of a particular methodology to consciously stimulate mental imagery as associated with students who are in this category helped us feel much more comfortable and understand that the tenets of dual coding theory indeed did apply to this population. Well, that's all well and good in a clinical setting. What about in public education? A paper was produced entitled The Effects of a Theoretically Based Large-Scale Reading Intervention in a Multicultural Urban District. This was in Pueblo School District in Colorado. Cutting to the chase, we took 8 years, over 400, and this is the application I might add, in working with students, both who had decoding issues, possibly some of which were dyslexic, as well as students who had language comprehension deficit. In any case, the 470 students were moved out of special education, and over 9,000 at-risk students received intensive reading intervention, and over 25,000 children received the developmental reading instruction over that period of time. There were lots of results, but highlighting the statistical significance of it, we saw increasing gains favoring the DCT-based reading intervention were found both overall and in analysis of these Title I schools. In conclusion, out of that paper, the emphasis on associating language with multisensory mental images is a direct application of dual coding theory. The authors go on to say that any theory of reading or writing that does not eventually align with a broader theory of general cognition will not endure. Reading and writing, bottom line, are cognitive acts. So I hinted at the beginning of the presentation that we think that there's a more robust way to think about literacy above and beyond, not to take anything away from what is being called the science of reading, where dual coding can be thought of as a cognitive science of learning, embedding what we think about are the important constituents of being able to read. If you think about it from a coding standpoint, the science of reading or the cognitive science of learning, the simple view of reading is a model of the science of reading. It's basically is presumptuous and based upon the single code, language. What we're suggesting is that the cognitive science of learning, in our case, using the tenets again of dual coding theory, is applying sensory cognitive functions to all learning, not just being able to decode print. The two codes, language and mental representation, then offers a more comprehensive look at being able to be literate. Reading is cognition, and cognition is the interplay of mental representation and language. It's not just a single code. Decoding, syntax, semantics, morphology, they're all necessary, but they're not sufficient. We think that going deeper into the mental representation architecture, what's going on in the human brain, as I've been indicating through this presentation, offer a conclusion that decoding, phonology, orthography, memory, and comprehension all fit within a broader theoretical model of dual coding theory. In other words, a cognitive science of learning. There it is. Both sides of the coin, imagery, language, instruction reveals significant improvements in language and literacy skills across the population, regardless of where they fall within this spectrum. If we measure sensory cognitive processing and differentiate the diagnosis and provide instruction to develop sensory input of imagery to interplay with language, individuals can become independent in language and literacy skills. I'll thank you for your attention, and if you need more information, feel free to contact us. My email and our contact information is indicated here. Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening. Learn more about us at Lindamood-Bell.com. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We are Lindamood-Bell.